Welcome to the Data Leadership Lessons Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony J. Algman. Data is everywhere in our businesses, and it takes leadership to make the most of it. We bring you the people, stories, and lessons to help you become a data leader. Today, we welcome Andrell Holloway. Andrell is a highly driven and creative leader with diverse industry experience across publicly traded, private, and public sector entities. He is focused on collaborating with management to help ensure robust internal control environments, strengthen governance, and address organizational challenges. Andrell develops resilient relationships with management and boards based on capability, confidence, and trust. As for me personally, Andrell has been an enormous inspiration and influence in my understanding of scaling management and leadership responsibilities from departmental to organizational levels and beyond. In the public sector world where we got to know each other, seeing Andrell's commitment to helping real people fundamentally changed how I approach my own career. And I'm sure I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So Andrell, welcome to Data Leadership Lessons. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me on the show.
So why don't we just get started? Just take us through, give us a few minutes on your background and career story and kind of what it is that you really do. And you know, we'll talk about some data stuff.
Sure. So currently I am the audit director for North America for a large transportation company here in the United States. And my role in leading that department is to really help ensure there's good governance, good internal controls over processes, and fundamentally, something that we can all probably relate to is payroll. How do we make sure that, we work our hours, whether we're salary or hourly? We want to make sure that we're paid, for those hours. So fundamentally, what I'm looking to do is make sure that there's good process and controls to make sure that everyone's paid in full, timely, et cetera. But more broadly than that, I think is really helping the organization meet its goals and objectives, whatever they may be, operationally, strategically, financially. For example, I've been at a couple organizations, including a current organization, that's really focused on driving process efficiency, driving excellence. And so audit can really contribute from just checking the box and making sure that, yes, payroll's paid on time, but we can also look at a process and step back and say, great, this is how the process is currently designed. Is there a better way that we can do it? Collaborating with management to see, can we automate through systems? Can we pare down a process, ultimately to make a process or an activity run more efficiently and save some cost along the way.
And I feel like I know you well enough to know what some of your answers are going to be, but I want to ask you the questions anyway, because I think it's so interesting, to expand on the kind of general notion of what audit is. I think audit, it gets probably unfairly bucketed into this like necessary evil category. And there's a lot more to it than that. And I think I want to start by asking around more details as to audit's role in innovation, because I think there's a huge part to how we validate our data in through audits, because obviously you spend a lot of time in auditing looking at data. How do we, through that audit function, help drive these kinds of improvements that we're always looking to have in our organizations? I mean, if you listen to any of these episodes, like data leadership's all about all these change management functions, transforming how our businesses work. Sounds a lot like what we were just talking about. How does an auditor contribute to that very directly?
I think the way that we contribute to it is that fundamentally, I'm not effective in an organization unless I know how that organization ticks, unless I know how processes both should be executed and how they actually are executed within that organization. Yeah. And there's a lot of variability. And so I think one way that we play a role in innovation is we typically have seen some real issues in a particular process that clearly need to be addressed, some type of gap or delta that's wider than what's expected, right, from a standard to what the actual current condition is. But beyond that, I think our role is to say, hey, can we do things a bit better? And I'll even talk about innovation from an audit perspective. When I was at CPS, for example, there were 500 schools, and the board really challenged us to both make sure that they had better comfort, that things in schools were operating the way that they should operate, and also to get more coverage across all the schools that were there. There's no way with even a moderate-sized audit staff that I could audit 500 schools in a 3-year cycle. So we really have to step back and think about what can we do. And so there are two things that really happened that I would say are innovative for a school district. We realized that we called CPS jokingly not a school system, but a system of schools, where you had a lot of schools that operated fairly independently from an administrative, payroll, financial perspective. And so we wanted to sit back, and we first started with process standardization, right? Yeah. If we can make sure that the processes are consistent across the schools, you would assume that there are less errors. Then we figured out that wasn't really good enough, particularly because governments always need more money. There's always budget deficits. And so we started to really look at something that was innovative, I think, in public school districts, and that's to implement a shared services center. And so audit was a big part of looking at those processes and saying, what could we strip out of the schools and put into an existing shared services center, but a much more scaled, if you will, shared services center. And so what it allowed the district to do is make other financial decisions around how those schools operated, because we're able to extract some of these processes out, have assurance that they were being performed consistently, and again, gave them freedom to make other decisions around the staff that was previously performing that work. Now, from an audit perspective, I feel like it was also created an opportunity for us to innovate in audit, because I now had the ability to look at a lot of these transactions in real time, and I could look at them continuously. We call it continuous auditing, continuous monitoring, but I knew that these transactions should happen with more predictability, and we're able to bring in a capability where we essentially created a daily data dashboard, and we looked at, say, 20 types of transactions, and we knew what was sort of good, not so good, and really something that needed to be looked at. So we simply came back with a red, yellow, green sort of indication that says that, hey, these schools have some issues, and if it's red, maybe we need to audit, we need to call, or otherwise take action. So it helped, in my opinion, from an innovation perspective, because again, schools were operating more effectively, less costly. The district could pull some cost out if it wanted to. I'm able to go back to the board and say, hey, I'm not auditing more schools physically, but I'm auditing and looking at almost all schools virtually, and I can give you a better sense what your risk level is with less cost.
Oh man, there's so much to unpack here. But like, I can promise you, first, somebody who's listening to this show will have said, oh man, that is exactly what I do. We just don't call it auditing. We don't call it internal audit. Like, it's exactly what we talk about all the time in the data space, because you're literally, like, you're looking at all the data, you're identifying opportunities to improve the actual operations, and then you're suggesting exactly how you think they might be able to improve things. It's like, that's exactly what data leadership is all about. Literally, like, that is literally the definition of what we talk about with data leadership. And so it's amazing, because this is so new to a lot of people. They're like, a lot of folks don't have the opportunity to interact with auditors, except in the role of just providing them some data upon request. Like, that's the interaction that many of us in the data community tend to have. But I kind of go back to, one of the first things you said, about audit, which is, how you are there to confirm that what is actually happening is what is supposed to be happening. Like we are all about, like, when we think about like data governance and stuff, we think about like, oh, we're going to create some policies and we're going to enforce that or whatever. How are we going to enforce that? That's a thing we don't talk a lot about in data governance. We're like, well, if it's in a policy, people should be doing it. How's that go? Like, people don't do that just because it's written in a document somewhere. They put it on SharePoint where no one can ever find it again, and if they do find it, they don't have access to it. Like, that doesn't get things done. And so I think that what you do in audit actually is so much more important than I think people realize, because that's that elastic between the policy and the actual activities that are happening in the organization. When you talk about a place like CPS, Chicago Public Schools, when you talk about something like that, you realize when you start looking at data, there's so much opportunity to find where things aren't necessarily in alignment with even people's intentions. They would like to be following that policy, but without data, they don't have the visibility into it. So what are some of your thoughts on kind of that broad view of audit as such a core component of data governance that people may not be seeing?
You're absolutely right. Fundamentally, our role is to confirm that management. So let me step back and think about how I would plan out my audit year, because a lot of folks have probably participated in these types of conversations where you're talking with a lot of folks in management. You're doing what we call a risk assessment, and we're basically saying, hey, this is the risk profile for the organization. And, that risk profile could have 50 risk, right? But, or more, we can't audit 50 risk. And so what we will then do is say, well, what are the top 10, 15 risk? And from my perspective, we really have three ways that we can approach, say, auditing or reviewing or having some impact on those top 10 risks. And the first one is doing some type of validation activity. The second one is doing some type of advisory activity. Or the third one is really just sitting back and waiting and expecting management to provide some type of reaction to that in say, an enterprise risk management sort of component or space. And so what you're talking about is that validation piece. So management said, yes, this is a top 10 risk. We think we're controlling this risk very, very well. Great. I want to give you some assurance that the policy says X, and they're executing according to that policy. And a lot of times you see drift away from the policy for a number of reasons. It could be that sometimes policies, believe it or not, simply aren't communicated. There could be transitions on teams, and people just start picking up a practice that their predecessor had implemented, which again drifted away from the policy. And so that is what's fundamentally basic about audit, is to say you expect X to happen and X is happening. And if not, here are the deltas and here's why. And that's another important piece. A good auditor is not just going to tell you that you have this deviation, but we need to understand what is causing that deviation. Is there something that has changed that requires the policy to change? Is there something that is absent in terms of a skill set, a capability? Is there a system limitation? And so that's the value of a good auditor, to have that conversation to help management say, okay, A, I understand. B, I understand the issue. I understand the impact and the risk that's presented, and what action needs to happen. And hopefully when I write up that recommendation, management's fully on board and they take some action and come back. But let's take another scenario where there's a risk where I go to management. It is not the scenario where they're like, we got it, policies in place, and that's where I do the validation. Sometimes management will say, you're right, that risk is, clearly in the top 10. I don't think we do a very good job of managing that, and we haven't really been able to get our hands around that. And so that's where audit can step in a advisory role and really just sit back and work with the management to really evaluate and think through that risk, think through what are some ways that you could address that risk and work with them and move it forward. And then finally, there could be that third piece where management feels that there's either a problem or there's not a problem, Audit's role is simply to say, hey, management, I want to have a conversation with you in Q2 about this particular risk. We're going to sit down, we're going to have a conversation at some point. Leadership has probably already set some expectations for how they're going to manage that risk. And I'm just going to come in there, perhaps have a conversation and really go from there. And that may be it at the end of the day.
Yeah, the risk management piece of all of this, I think, is something that it's so embedded in everything that an auditor does. And I don't know that that's as well understood by, the general population of non-auditor folks, as it should be. So I think that's extremely helpful. And I have a couple different lines of questioning and kind of take it in what order you think makes the most sense. Is I'm curious your thoughts on both, like, what makes for well-written policy, especially for those organizations that are trying to become more quantitatively oriented. Because, like, obviously from an audit perspective, you've kind of talked about how, when you have data that you can leverage as an auditor reliably, it gives you so much more coverage of being able to understand what's really happening. And so, like, understanding how good policy and how good data capture may lead to better risk management functionally. Like, because I often talk about, like, nobody really cares about data governance. They care about the outputs of data governance. Like, I don't think anybody is like, oh, we got to get that auditing, except for the fact that the auditing leads to some conclusion, some improvement of risk management or opportunities as a business to get better at something. That's the thing people care about. And so then their solution is to, we need to improve our auditing capabilities. And so the one piece is, like, what makes for good policy? How do you write good policy? And then the second piece comes back to, when you're working with data in this risk management capacity, how do you distill what's important? How do you find the truth as an auditor versus, a concern that leadership may have their finger on the scale, as they say, like bias based on a preconceived notion is always concerning when it comes to data. I had a recent podcast episode where I introduced this term that I hadn't heard before, but I think it really makes sense, is that a lot of these organizations out there today, they talk about wanting to be data driven, which is great. We want to be data driven, but they go off and do whatever they want anyway. And then when they're done, they go back and say, well, here's data to support it. And it's not data driven at that point. It's data justified. You went and you picked the data to justify what you did anyway. That's not what we're talking about here. What we want to do is get to the truth. We want to get to the answers, and then we want to drive future activities based on our understanding of that data and understanding of the truth. So in my mind, audit really lives in that place. It's like, how do we understand what the truth really is when we know policies aren't perfect, people aren't implementing them well? So how can we treat it on either side? How can we understand, the policy and what's good to consider when we're crafting policy? And then how do we make sure when we're analyzing that data from an audit perspective, how do we keep from introducing unintentional bias?
Gotcha. When I think of what makes a good policy, I'll talk about a couple of attributes related to it, but I think that there's a couple things that are really important beyond the policy that makes the policy more effective and makes the policy more likely to be followed within an organization. So, when I look at a policy, the first thing that I think any author of a policy, drafter of a policy should step back and think about is, what are we intending to communicate? What are the objectives? What are we trying? What's the outcome we're trying to get to for a particular process? What are the objectives for that process? And be very clear about how to achieve those outcomes. What is the process that should be followed consistently to drive to that outcome? I think some other attributes within that policy, what systems, are to be used, when something should be done, who should do it. And also look at it from a control perspective. How are you making sure that it's getting done? So we can write controls that actually, a lot of people probably see policies that have statements in there that I can read and I can say, okay, that's a control.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's a sort of a primary or key control, that's a secondary control. And I think people are naturally writing this because they're saying, how do I make sure this goes right? That's a control, right? How do I make sure it goes right? And how can I check to make sure that it went right is a control. So I think that's what I think about it in terms of a policy. What are we trying to achieve? What's the expected outcome? How are we going to get there? Through what system? Who's going to do it? And at what interval, et cetera. But I think what also causes policies to fail is that sometimes that's where policies end. There's a lot of change management and communication that really needs to happen to really make that policy active within the organization. How are we identifying who are the people that need to know the policy? Who are the people that are impacted directly and indirectly? What changes do we need to make sure that that policy is actually implemented? And I should have said this. I'll go all the way back to the start. Those same people that are directly or indirectly impacted by the policy should have been consulting early on when that policy was being drafted, because they probably have some insights on the practice, et cetera. And then in terms of when I come in to audit that policy, I'm looking for some indicators that would help me provide evidence that the activity happened. It could be something as simple as a sign off to say that payroll was reviewed, or something within a system that would flag something happening once it hit a certain criteria. And I think in a lot of folks' world, when you hear things like key performance indicators, when you hear things like performance management, those same types of indicators, those same things that you're looking for to say something is going off the road or not, that's the same type of indicator that I'm looking for. And then what I then do is look for evidence that it actually occurred. Can I see evidence in the system? Can I see a sign off on an invoice? Can I see, for example, things that are less sort of cut and dry? So, for example, if we're looking at a loan loss reserve and there's some judgment, there's not some judgment, there's a lot of judgment in terms of what drives that sort of reserve change. Should we increase it by $1 million? Should we increase it by 10% or whatever the factor is? And so I'm looking at the documentation, the analysis of that evaluation. What are some internal factors? What are some external factors? Sort of economic factors, whatever it may be that drives that decision. So ultimately, I am looking for, to your point, tangible evidence that is directly related to that activity, as opposed to something that sort of justifies an activity that happened, post activity. You're looking for that sort of, what makes it right versus what was something that was sort of direct evidence. And the one thing I had this question posed to me before, and I think it's something that, particularly when you get into these sort of judgmental, subjective areas, someone asked me, well, how do you audit what's gray? And I told them, I'll sort of throw it back on you. How do you justify what's gray if you're the CFO, if you're the controller? And the way that I would look at it is to say that, sometimes 2 + 2 isn't 4, right? Sometimes 2 + 2 is, 4.5 or something. There's something that's changed, particularly over the last year, for example, when you look at how the market changed and impacted contracts and companies with significant sales declines, significant business volumes, and different things like that. But the way that I look at it, and I would think about this from an audit lens, is that it's either 2 + 2 = 4, which is very clear, everyone can agree to, right? Or it could be that there's something that explains why it's off. And if I can say that out loud in a room full of people, I feel like that it may not be it may not be exactly 4. It may be 4.5, but whatever it is something that, generally speaking, folks can agree with. Because if I can say it in a loud room, it's either right, it's gray, but it's not wrong. And so, that's another way. I don't know if that's coming across quite clearly, but that's another way that I kind of look at evidence, is that if I can talk and support that evidence in a room full of my peers, right? now I feel like I have good evidence that really supports that activity is happening and happened the way it would be expected to happen by a reasonable person, if you will.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it highlights something that is easy for us to forget about sometimes too, and that is like data's often not ones and zeros in its analysis. There is often gray, there is often middle ground, and you can kind of throw in any example of that, and it's pertinent because and that's where I think the risk management, when we think about it in terms of risk management, it's a lot easier to internalize, because we want to think of data as ones and zeros, but it's really not always completely clear. I think about, I had some electrical work done at the house not too long ago, and I had an inspection done, and the inspector came out to see how we ran the wires and how the circuit was hooked up and stuff. And he's like, had a couple questions for me, and I wasn't the electrician, but I remember having the conversations or whatever. I was able to say, oh yeah, they said that we needed to do it this way or whatever. He's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. That's cool. And he wasn't there to, like, I was scared. I was literally scared. I haven't done a whole lot of work around my house. I was scared when the inspector was coming from the village to like take a look at all this work. I'm like, did I just waste a ton of money? What was going to happen? And I was worried that he was just coming there to cause me pain. And then when I interacted with him, he was like, no, he was there to make sure it didn't burn down my house. You know, like that was the thing that he was there to do, is to make sure that it was done appropriately within some guidelines, but he wasn't there to try to catch me on something. And I think that's an important thing for people to remember too, is that auditors are not there just to make your life harder. They're there to help, and that involves, you know, some give and take more than people might necessarily think.
I absolutely agree, and I am a firm believer in relationship-based auditing, if you will. So again, you know, as you know, I started a new role recently, and what I am doing is reaching out to a number of the leaders across the organization at the sort of SVP level and 2 or 3 layers down. And I'm doing it for 2 reasons. Number one, I want to understand more about risk from their perspective. You know, I'm asking them, for example, you know, if you could change 2 or 3 things in the organization, I don't care if they're under your area of responsibility or not, what would they be? That starts to help me get a sense of their mindset, but also broader risk across the organization. But another key piece there is that the first time that leadership should meet, an audit should not be the first time that leadership meets the auditor, right?
Yeah.
Because it takes away that sort of stigma that you're talking about there. I want you to know who I am. I want you to know who the team is before we engage with you during an audit, because it's exactly that you know, we're here to help make sure this organization is ultimately successful. And you know, the days of gotcha auditing, or you know, I'm paid by the finding type of auditing, you know, is gone. I would argue that a metric that I use in terms of how effective we are as an audit team is how many times do I get a knock, virtually or otherwise, on my door from management to say, hey, I have a question. Can we talk about this? Or, hey, there's a meeting where we're talking about a new system that we're thinking about. Can audit, you know, send a representative to the meeting? That's when we're starting to engage. That's that relationship-based auditing that I am referring to. And the other, I think, value, the value that provides is that when we do an audit and we do have an issue, it could be an issue that's significant. It could be a high-risk issue that needs to be remediated immediately. It could be something that could either be costly or something that could be really frustrating to the organization. I think it allows me, because of that relationship, to speak with the firmness that I need as an auditor, and the conviction that I need as an auditor, but also for them to have sort of trust that, you know, hey, I'm here to help this organization, and therefore I'm here to help you. So I always say we're big boys and girls. Let's address the issue. Let's agree to the issue. Let's address the issue, and let's really move on. And that, I think, really helps the organization get past the risk issues. And to your point, you know, we're here to make the business not make the business, to help the business be successful by looking at these risks, look at the threats to them not having or achieving that success.
Yeah. And I was thinking, we've been talking a lot about the audit perspective, which I think is unique, and I'm glad that we've kind of dived into a lot of that. But for the remainder of this, I want to, because when I think of you, and we've known each other for 6-7 years at least now, and when I think of you, I know your function, the thing that you do, is auditing by trade. Like, that's where you grew up, that's a big focus of what you do, whatever role you're in. But I don't think of you as auditor first. I think of you as senior leader first. I think of you as an executive first. And I'd like to understand your perspective as an executive, as a person who's worked in a number of large organizations in very senior roles. You've always struck me as a person who has this leadership quality and being able to like bring together significant numbers of people in a shared mission. And I really want to dive a little bit into that. And so let's start by, take off the audit hat and say, as a senior leader, what data do you look at? What are the things that you want to think about, even just in your own management responsibilities? What are the kinds of things that you as a senior leader today find yourself working with regularly from a data perspective?
Yeah, I think some of it starts with the same basic information that you would likely expect. We're looking at, how are we performing, year to year, quarter to quarter. You're looking at budget to actuals and different things like that. So I think from a quantitative perspective, it's a lot of the same types of information. But I think the other thing that I am really interested in is when you think about performance management or key performance indicators, I love looking for that type of information around the organization, because what I feel that it does, it starts to tell me something that could be going astray before we see it on a quantitative basis, perhaps.
Yeah.
And so that's where I really live, if you will. And I think it's also something that really drives me. I like looking for challenges. I like looking for a problem, quite honestly. And so, I'm looking for data. I'm looking for information that's telling me that, hey, here's something that is either, clearly, going wrong, or something that is inefficient, or something that, could has the potential to cause some organizational issues. The other thing that I really believe in is people, and as a leader, I look at it both internally and externally, sort of within the department, if you will. So externally, getting back to what I said before, I need to develop relationships with management.
Yeah.
They need to know who I am. They need to know why I'm there. They need to know that I'm not just here, with the auditor hat. To your point, I have the audit hat. I'm comfortable in the audit hat. I'm much more comfortable in that sort of advisory and less collaborate type of hat, and so or role. And so that's why I get out there and I talk with management, because they're going to come to me, and sometimes they're going to come to me probably before they even go to perhaps their boss or whoever they report into, because they're probably looking for help to say, let's get a handle on this, or that same thing. If you bring me a problem, also bring me a solution. They're probably looking for me to help them solution. And then real quickly, and finally, on this topic, at least internally, I'm a big believer in my team in terms of having a team. I cannot deliver on audits, goals, and objectives singularly by myself. So I am a firm believer in building strong teams that feel like that they have the ability to execute on what they need to do. I am by no means a micromanager. I want to enable my team to be successful, and be there to support them when they have a challenge, be there to catch them, hopefully, before they fall down if something happens, but also to support them in conversations with leadership, but particularly when there's challenging conversations. And I feel that when I do that, I get teams that also perform much more at a much higher level performance-wise than others. So I really, really value having a team and developing a team and letting the team know that I have their back in the organization, but also we have a job to do and we're going to do it well.
Yeah, and just hearing you talk about that and reflecting back to the times that we've worked together, I'll add a couple other things that I've observed in the way you act and kind of correspond to some of the things that you're talking about is that, one, I don't think I've ever heard you say that's not an audit problem or that's not our area. Like if there's a problem to be solved, you're interested and you're first hands on trying to run some numbers. And there is that common thread of like being a data person allows you to pull on that thread and investigate something on your own. Like if you have data, if you have a big set of data and an Excel spreadsheet or some other tool to do analysis, you can start to figure out answers on your own. And there's something to be said for that. The other thing is that I'd definitely echo your ability to bring together strong teams and all of that. I don't have much more to add on that, except for the fact that obviously in the roles that you've had, like comes with the territory, you're very busy, a lot of chaos, things are always happening. But I always found you had this ability to be in the moment and always have time for the important stuff. If somebody needed your help or, to your point around having people's backs and really being there for your team, that was also something that I observed that, you have a very strong ability to make that human connection and you're doing it with everyone around you. It's not just working with the other senior leaders, but it's everybody on your team or everybody that you can help, is that you would always have that time to learn and understand and find how you can grow from that interaction, as well as how can you help that person in that moment. And those were things that I observed that I took with me in my career as we've gone on different paths after the last 5 or 6 years, but still resonates with me today and something that you have influenced. So I want to say thank you for that, because you showed me how to do some of these things in ways I hadn't seen quite the same way before.
Thank you.
So, and we have very little time left, but I want to talk a little bit more, just knowing that you've spent a fair amount of time in the public sector, and we did some work together in the public sector, and the data is everywhere. And I think a lot of folks who haven't spent time in the public sector don't realize just what a rich environment, not just of having a ton of data, but the innovation with data in the public sector space, I'll put up against any industry. And a lot of it is because of like the public level accountability of things and all of that, and the freedom of information and all of those kinds of things. I want to talk a little bit about like the role of data in the public sector, especially when it comes to what you've seen with open data, either in the education space or in the transportation space. Where do you see that role of data today, and how is it evolving from your vantage point?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of places, to your point, in public sector where data can play a role. And I would say that the same way. So if I look at Chicago Transit Authority, now this is something that is, I'm sure a lot of folks there have thought about it or continue to think about it. They think about the CTA service that's provided now is fixed route services, very predictable. We know in the morning, in the on the morning rush, the afternoon rush, and probably sometimes in between, you're going to have buses that are absolutely packed, trains are absolutely packed, and other times they're not. But they're still running on that same predictable sort of service. I think that's a great source of data to say, can we start thinking about on-demand sort of transportation, if you will, and balancing some of the other downsides of that, along the way, because I feel like fundamentally, when you're in the public sector, because of public dollars being involved, you have a fundamental fiduciary responsibility to always be looking for a way to streamline service, provide the service that you need to provide at the least possible cost, simply because of the dollars that are at stake and the public dollars that are driving, those services. So yeah, it could be something that's painful to implement. It could be something that could lead to a loss of some jobs, and nobody wants to lose their job. But in the public sector, I think that we have that obligation, that responsibility to do it. And so I think, to your point with data being there, I think there's also the opportunity in the educational space to just look at how students are sort of dispersed across the city, and where are there ways that we can just figure out to sort of save cost in different ways. You can go to some schools and they're absolutely packed. Not to compare them to the CTA example, but some schools are absolutely packed, and some schools that are really a shell of their former selves. And so you have to think about it from the perspective of, if their school is absolutely packed, they probably have much more diversity in terms of the types of classes that are provided, the quality of some of the extracurricular activities, the experience socially that they have in that environment versus this other school that's maybe 10, 20% of the capacity. So you take the financial sort of responsibility to basically manage public sector costs. You also have to look at this more from a qualitative perspective. Are we providing the best education that we can, with the ways that schools are sort of with how students are distributed across schools? But you also get into very social economic issues and challenges and things of that sort. But I think the data is there. I think we have to have the courage, I think, to act on that data. We have to have the courage to do what it tells us to do. People may hate us now; they'll love us in the future. I say us. I'm not in the public sector anymore, but that is what I think is needed, and that's why the best job I've had in my life thus far has been in the public sector. The most rewarding work I've ever done has been in the public sector, because of what we're talking about, because of the ability and the responsibility to look at things quantitatively and qualitatively, and how it impacts people.
Yeah, I mean, you really can't replace the connection that you feel when you're helping people for real, like where you can draw that line of sight. The work I'm doing here is making education better for our kids, or providing people a way of moving around and getting to work and getting to their family and things like that. And that, I think, especially coming out of this pandemic, hopefully things are right, are getting better, and we're on the right path there. But I think a lot of people may have in mind wanting to do something that's more meaningful, and having that opportunity in the public sector. It can certainly be a thankless job at times, but it is it is rewarding in different ways, and that gets you through it, and there's a lot of good that comes from that. And so I'm glad we got to talk about it, even just for a couple minutes. I think functionally the audit piece is so interesting to our profession of data management folks and data leaders out there, but I do think that having that opportunity to speak a little bit about the public sector certainly worthwhile, and hopefully it sparks some interest in folks out there that are trying to figure out what they're doing in their career. Don't dismiss the public sector because you think it's old and boring or whatever. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on there, and there's some different mechanisms in terms of the value that you get in your career and being in that place. So I certainly appreciate hearing that. So we are all out of time at this point, and I feel like we could talk for another hour or two, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to have you back at some point again in the future. But I really appreciate you doing this. This has been awesome content. I think it's unique and is going to really help a lot of folks out there. So thank you again for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all out there for watching or listening today. In the show notes, you'll find useful links and more information about today's topic. Follow Data Leadership Lessons on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Check out my book at dataleadershipbook.com and use promo code ALGMANDL at the Dataversity Training Center for 20% off your first purchase. Stay safe during these unusual times and go make an impact.